Okay, let's talk a little bit about air masses, which are the basis for all weather. This starts our weather section here for Earth science. So let's talk about some air masses. Air masses, they're the main reason for weather. Without air masses, you can't have the different types of weather, whether that's the snow up here in the top, or the thunderstorm down here, or the hurricane here. You can't have weather if you don't have an air mass. So they're very important for weather, not only here in Kansas City, but worldwide. They're basically just what the title says. They're large movements, large bodies of air. That's why they're called an air mass, because they're considered very large. That's why they're mass, and they're obviously made of air, so they're called air masses. So, main reason for weather and very massive. The air in an air mass is always similar to the air mass itself. In other words, the individual particles of air that are in this large entity known as an air mass are always similar to the air mass as a whole. So, if you have a warm, wet air mass that moves into an area, the air inside of that air mass is also going to be warm and wet. So they're basically the same thing. Same thing happens if you have a cold, dry air mass move into an area. Like what happens sometimes here in Kansas City during the winter. If it's cold and dry in the air mass as a whole, the individual particles inside of that air mass are also cold and dry. So don't miss this one on the test because it'll be really embarrassing because basically whatever the air mass is like as a whole, the little particles inside of that air mass are the same as well. Air masses are really huge, like really, 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 really big, sometimes the size of multiple states. And sometimes, since they're so big, it takes days and even weeks for them to move through an area. Whenever this happens, that's what's called air mass weather. And this happens sometime in Kansas City in the wintertime and also in the summertime where air just does not move. The air mass stays over an area, it doesn't move. In the wintertime, when this happens, this is when you like it. We get out of school because the air mass stays over Kansas City. It's cold, sometimes it's wet and moist, and the air will just cause a lot of snow and a lot of ice in that area. Also happens in the summertime here in Kansas City is where, well, when a warm, dry air mass will come over Kansas City and stay, and that's when it's really hot outside. It's miserable outside, and the temperatures can be well over 100 degrees for several days straight. And that's called air mass weather. It's when the air mass moves into an area and it doesn't move, so there's no relief. The weather stays the same the entire time that that air mass is in the area. Types of air masses. Again, this is pretty simple, guys. So if you miss this on the test, I'm probably going to make fun of you because these are really, really easy to remember. So check it out. First of all, the air mass type depends on where the air mass begins, or where does it start. That all determines what the air mass is called and how it is. A continental air mass starts over land. That's why it's called continental, because it starts over a continent. The maritime air mass starts over water, kind of like marina if you go to the lake, or if you go to an ocean, or sometimes maybe even on a river, they have a marina. That's where they hold different boats and things they use on the water. Maritime stands for water, so a maritime air mass starts over water. So with continental, it starts over land, which has much less moisture, obviously, so that's a dry air mass for the most part. The maritime air mass starts over water, and since it starts over water, it has much more moisture in it, so usually a maritime air mass, it has a lot of moisture in it. Now, two other ways we classify air masses are a polar air mass, so just like Santa Claus, the North Pole or the South Pole. For the United States, we get all of our polar air masses, for the most part, from the North Pole. A polar air mass starts at the Earth's pole. So since it starts from the Earth's pole, it's going to, for the most part, be a cold air mass. The other one we get here in the United States is a tropical air mass. And tropics are a warm part of the Earth. As you know, when you think of tropical things, you think of warm, and that's exactly correct. Because a tropical air mass starts in the tropics, or the warm parts of the Earth. So you have four types of air masses: continental, which starts over land; maritime, which starts over water; and polar, which starts over the Earth's poles, which is usually cold; and tropical, which starts over the tropical parts of the Earth down near the equator, where it's warm. And here's how weather is determined. Basically, the air masses mix. And here's another one that you cannot miss on the test because this is really easy. Air masses are abbreviated by their first letter. So for example, kids, C stands for continental and P stands for polar because C is what continental starts with and P is what polar starts with. Pretty complicated stuff here. Air mass letters can be combined, and that's how we describe certain weather situations that occur. So if we say CT, it would be a continental tropical air mass. So that would be an air mass that is from the continents, so it's dry, and it's tropical, so it's warm, so it would be a dry, warm air mass. And notice here, the first letter is always lowercase. It's kind of a weird thing that weather people do. It's kind of opposite of what you would normally think, but the first letter is always lowercase, and the second letter is always a capital. So most weather in the United States is caused by continental polar air masses, and this is usually what we get in the wintertime. It's a cold, dry air mass, and in the summertime and in the spring, we get a maritime tropical air mass, which of course is abbreviated MT because maritime starts with M and tropical starts with T. So let's describe a continental polar air mass. Continental polar CP. Again, what's it start with? A C and a P. It's pretty complicated stuff. They're cool and dry. They're cool because they come from the poles, mostly from the North Pole here in the United States, and they're dry because they start over the continents. So they don't have much moisture because it's over land and it's not over water. And whenever these move into an area, it produces very cold weather because it's from the poles and very clear skies. And the reason why it produces clear skies is because there's just not much moisture in that air to produce clouds and precipitation. So people get bundled up like these two people, and the air usually looks clear and blue. These are kind of those confusing days in the winter when you go outside and it looks beautiful, the sun's out, and you think it's going to be warm and it's really cold. Well, when that happens, that's a continental polar air mass. Maritime tropical. Maritime stands for an air mass that comes from an area that has water, and tropical stands for air mass that's warm. And it's abbreviated, of course, MT because, once again, maritime starts with M and tropical starts with T. These are warm and they're loaded with moisture. And usually what happens, this is a summertime air mass for the most part, leads to very hot temperatures and precipitation. And these are the ones that are really exciting because these are the ones that produce the very large thunderstorms, sometimes tornadoes, the exciting kind of severe weather that we experience here in the Midwest. It comes from a maritime tropical air mass because they're warm and they're loaded with moisture. So you're going to get your precipitation, you're going to get very hot temperatures from this air mass. Next one is a maritime polar air mass. And again, MP, maritime starts with M, polar starts with P, so they abbreviate it as MP. They do come from the United States from the north. It's from the poles, from the North Pole, where Santa and his elves and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer live. Maritime polar temperatures come from the north parts of the Earth to the United States. These start out as cold, dry air masses. So when they're in the poles or North Pole, they start as a very cold, dry air mass. But as it moves across the United States, it gets more moist. It picks up moisture from the maritime or from the water, and it becomes more moist as it moves across the United States. And this produces very heavy precipitation. As you can see from the little kids with the people and maybe their dads or moms here on the bike, there's a lot of precipitation and can cause some real problems in areas, especially in the wintertime, because if you get a cold air mass that has a lot of moisture in it, it's going to produce heavy precipitation, a lot of snow, and some real problems, especially here in Kansas City, as you know, with some of the snow days that we've had recently. Final air mass here is called a continental tropical air mass. You can see here, this is actually a pond that's dried up, and these are fish from that pond that have died in what's called a drought in an area. And these are caused by continental tropical air masses. Continental meaning coming from land, tropical meaning very warm. So again, abbreviated CT because continental starts with C and tropical starts with T. These are hot and very dry. They're very hot because they come from the tropical parts of the Earth, mainly down by the equator, the Gulf of Mexico, and they're very dry because they start over land and they don't start over the ocean like a maritime air mass would. So they're hot and very dry. The bad parts of this are if these move into an area, it can cause a drought in that area for a long time, especially if that air mass weather phenomenon we talked about earlier in the notes occurs. This can be real trouble for an area. We've had some of these in the Kansas City area over the past few summers where a continental tropical air mass will come in and it will just sit over the area for a week to 10 days, maybe even 2 weeks, and it can cause drought in the area. You see a lot of the people's lawns getting brown and sometimes animals dying, and our air conditioning bills go through the roof, but those are caused by continental tropical air masses. So that's it for the air mass notes. Good luck.